Okay, so part section 2 of Heart of Darkness begins with this line. One evening, as I was lying flat on the deck of my steamboat, while because Marlowe now spends most of his time with the steamboat in his effort to repair the boat so that the uh, the crew, the manager, some pilgrims who are living at the central station can all travel to the inner station where Kurtz resides according to their plan. Now, first section of chapter 2 is about a conversation between the manager and his uncle who had come to the central station along with the El Dorado exploring expedition. This is a new character. The manager's uncle enters the narrative with the El Dorado exploring expedition. And again, some negative, derogatory remarks are reserved for the uncle of the manager, who we are told resembled a butcher in a poor neighborhood. So, if we remind ourselves of the larger scheme, uh, and if we remind ourselves that basically this text is a criticism of colonial system, which is described as a system which is exploitative, unfair, and unjust, which is aimed at the plunder of the resources of Africa, and there is no semblance of any higher purpose which can be attached to the colonial rule of the European powers in the African regions. So, if we remind ourselves of all these things, we will find a confirmation, a corroboration of this. The El Dorado exploring expedition had been wandering in Africa for what? I read from the text. To tear treasure out of the bowels of the land was their desire, with no more moral purpose at the back of it than there is in burglars breaking into a safe. So not only is manager's uncle described as a butcher, the the expedition headed by him, which had a fancy name, El Dorado Exploring Expedition, is also described as an expedition which is engaged in loot and plunder. So, chapter 1 had ended with a reiteration of Kurtz's difference with the other characters. I will just read a few lines from the ending of chapter 1. I had plenty of time for meditation, and now and then I would give some thought to Kurtz. So, as I have already suggested in my earlier lecture, the image and the idea of Kurtz becomes not only an obsession but a fascination for Marlowe. Later on, I will read the lines. He will say that now, for me, the journey up the Congo River to the inner station had just one purpose, and it was to reach Kurtz. So, Kurtz is made to stand apart because he's described differently, whereas derogatory terms are reserved for most of the European figures who have suffered dehumanization and debasement in by involving themselves in the colonial enterprise. Kurtz is, if I once again quote from the text, I wasn't very interested in him No, still, I was curious to see whether this man who had come out equipped with the moral ideas of some sort would climb to the top after all, and how he would set alone his work when there, set about his work. Sorry. So this phrase kind of has an immediacy. It seems to uh, it seems to strike you as a very important phrase with reference to Kurds. What is it? Uh, who had come out equipped with moral ideas. So Kurds is, we can say, projected as the moral side of the colonial enterprise. He is, uh, we can say, an embodiment of the humanizing mission, the which acts as a justification for colonial rule, the which is often described as the white man's burden to civilize the uncivilized areas, to take the light of modernity to the rest of the world. So, whereas other figures which we have come across earlier in the text, such as the manager, the accountant, and now the so-called butcher, they are described in their physical dimensions. Kurtz is described in his moral dimensions. We have already seen a painting painted by him, which was seen hanging in one of the rooms in the earlier chapter. So we were told that there is a woman carrying a torch in her hand, and we were told that this. So this painting has been made by Kurtz when he was there, and then he advanced to the inner station. And what I was saying was that whereas the other characters are described in their physical dimensions, Kurtz is described in his moral dimensions, intellectual dimensions. So if others are equated with bodies, Kurtz is equated with intellect, with mind. So this we have to take note of. The next part in this chapter deals with the conversation between the manager and the manager's uncle, right under the place where Marlowe is resting. So, in the progress of the narrative, this marks a very important incident because here Marlowe happens to overhear the two of them. It is an accidental uh, development because Marlowe happens to be lying there and they come there for a stroll, and they are engaged in a dialogue. They are having a conversation which Marlowe seems to hear. So many things come out of this conversation which are quite revealing in nature. So they we can say expose the uncle and the manager to a great extent because they are talking about Kurtz, and we learn number one that Kurtz wields a lot of power in the organization. He is a very powerful person. Secondly, these two figures, the manager and his uncle, resent the rise of Kurtz to uh, his elevation to higher positions within the organization. So they are jealous of his growing influence. Then there is also a suggestion that they are hatching intrigues against Kurds in a very covert way. How, we will discuss it later, but there is a clear hint that these people are engaged in hatching some conspiracies. There is some plot against Kurds which is gradually taking shape, and which means to harm Kurds. We get a corroboration of this when, while talking to his nephew, the uncle says that the wilderness of Africa will one day finish Kurds. So there are this and several other hints through which we can decipher the intentions of the uncle and his nephew. They also there is also a hint which I have already mentioned, that Kurtz is considered as a human being of a higher order. Okay, he uh, represents certain values and ideals which are associated with European modernity. He is a purveyor, he is an embodiment of these ideals, mainly of progress, modernity, of a new age of human civilization, and he is looked upon as competition by these two. Then next we receive a very vital piece of information that Kurtz is not well, that he is ill and he needs to be rescued. Now let us come back to what I was saying. I said that there is a clear hint that these two are engaged in some kind of manipulative exercise. It seems they are engaged in hatching a plot, some intrigue. This intrigue is simply related with bringing Kurds back from the inner station. Okay. So, on their part, it seems there is a reluctance. There are very there are ploys, there are attempts, secret, clandestine attempts being made to delay the rescue of Kurds. But the second side of the story is revealed to us through another very important piece of information, again relating to Kurds. We are told that Kurds has been sending a lot of ivory from those regions to the central station. On one such, when a big consignment of ivory was being brought via the river in and in various canoes, Kurds also accompanied the group, and it seemed that he wanted to return. But then, now this is something not only remarkable, but this is something which is revelatory in nature, because for the first time, Marlowe says that I saw the image of Kurds flash before my eyes. And what is this information? We are told that Kurtz accompanied this group on his way back because obviously he is not well and to he needs to return to some place where he can restore his health. But we are told that he left the group some 300 miles from the inner station and returned all alone. This, for the first time, gives a kind of a concreteness to the image of Kurtz in the eyes of Marlowe, because in the narrative, he says that for the first time, it seemed that Kurtz materialized into a human being. Now, don't forget that Kurtz, when we look at his character, the first thing that strikes us is that he is elusive. Okay, he is residing in the deepest regions of the Free State of Congo. So, secondly, the attributes associated with his personality and character are such that they add to the enigma, the mystery of the figure. So, if one word defines Kurtz, it is that he is elusive. The journey begins. I will try to locate the line. The journey to the inner station, I should say, begins soon after this uh, first part of chapter 2. The journey is described in quite a clear detail. Now, one thing is that now the prospect of meeting Kurtz is becoming real for Marlowe. This is the first thing. But second is the challenge of steering the steamboat, which is not in a very good shape. Through that, this part is also dealt with, and this adds to the picture of Africa, which forms a very important subject of this. I will read a few sections of chapter 2 to give you an idea about this, because this is not only related with the thematic aspects of it comprises a very important subject. The description of the European colonizers and the description of African landscape, wilderness, and the people living there. They have to be counterbalanced in order to reach the meaning of this text. So, the journey, as I said, is not a very easy, comfortable journey. It is full of challenges which are described as islands, hidden banks, shoals, sunken stones, snags of various kind, make it difficult for Marlowe to steer the steamboat on this treacherous channel. So rather than looking at it in as an isolated, dimension of the text, I said it has to be linked with the larger picture of Africa, which is, now let me quote, going up the river. Yes, this is the beginning of the journey. It was just 2 months from the day we left the creek when we came to the bank below Kurtz's station. This journey is also marked by two, I should say, very important incidents, which are important in themselves in the larger scheme of the narrative because of their symbolic value and because of their importance in the narrative scheme. Going up the river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world when vegetation rioted on the earth and big trees were kings. Now, rarely does this writer use the word world. He has a propensity to prefer the term earth. This, I should say, is linked with the two or three things which become quite apparent as we go ahead in our reading of the text. One is the preference of the term earth is linked with the remoteness of perspective. It is a geological term, a topographic term, a term from geography. Earth is the name of a planet. When we use the term world, we see the world as one. When we use the term planet, becomes easier to polarize, to demarcate the earth. And this is exactly what Marlowe and Conrad seem to be doing, because for in this text, Earth is divided and demarcated into areas of light and areas of darkness. So Africa, where these Europeans have come as a part of the colonial enterprise, is an area of darkness. This theme uh, is amplified as we go ahead and we read the descriptions of the wilderness of Africa and the people belonging to Africa. The first set of people who happen to be on the steamboat are the cannibals. Cannibals are members of tribes who eat human flesh. So there are around 20 cannibals. We had enlisted some of these chaps on the way for a crew. Fine fellows, cannibals in their place. They were men one could work with. Now, without reading any more, the issue is that they are cannibals. They eat human flesh and they have brought a stock of hippo meat with them to eat. Uh, a few pages after the place where I was reading, uh, Marlowe expresses his astonishment at the fact that these cannibals were terribly hungry because part of the hippo meat had been thrown into the river by the pilgrims. So overall, we can say there are some pilgrims who were residing in the central station, the manager, Marlowe, and a few cannibals, and members of the crew on this steamboat. And uh, he is astonished by the restraint practiced by these cannibals who did not pose any threat to them, even though they were hungry. Later on, when they are still some distance from Kurtz's station, okay, there is an episode when they hear cries and shrieks, a clamor from the wilderness. Okay, and at this time, one of these fellows, the cannibals, says that catch them, catch him. We and he says, what will you do with them? He says, we'll eat him. And here a chain of thought begins, and Marlowe begins to, question himself why these cannibals spared them. And the answer is, you will find the answer quite interesting. They were big, powerful men with not much capacity to weigh the consequences with courage, with strength. Even yet, though their skins were no longer glossy and their muscles no longer hard. And I saw that something restraining one of those human secrets that baffle probability had come into play there. I looked at them with a swift quickening of interest. But because it occurred to me I might be eaten by them before very long, though I own to you that just then I perceived in a new light, as it were, how unwholesome the pilgrims looked. We will link this with several other things, but right now you can consider it to be the beginning of our discussion of Marlowe's description of the African natives, the African wilderness. Okay, he begins by describing these cannibals and he wonders why they did not eat the pilgrims who were weaklings compared to them, who were quite poorly built as far as these Africans were concerned. And the answer given provided by him is very interesting. And when I looked at the pilgrims in a new light, I saw that they looked quite unwholesome, quite unfit even for the cannibals to eat them. So here we can say that there is a quite a quite an interesting counterbalance between the African, the description of the Africans, and we have already seen that the Europeans are shown in an uncharitable light. The derogatory terms are used to describe them, but we can say the same things for the Africans also. Now, for whom does he reserve greater dislike? This is a very interesting question, because he gives Africans the credit for at least having some restraint and not running a riot on the steamboat, going about killing the Europeans and eating them. And this he attributes to the fact that the Europeans looked unwholesome. They were, they looked, they appeared to be unfit for even for the cannibals to eat. Add to this a couple of other. Now, let me read a few which can help you kind of form an idea about the representation of Africa, because that is a very important subject. The novel is set in Africa, and the representation of Congo, of the wilderness, of the Africans, and the perspective adopted by Marlowe happen to be of immense importance. We were wanderers on a prehistoric earth. Again, you have the word earth. On an earth that wore the aspect of an unknown planet. Then, a little later, the earth seemed unearthly. We were accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster, but there you could look at a thing monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and the men were, no, they were not human. Well, that was the worst of it. This suspicion of their not being inhuman, it would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces. But what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship. So, Heart of Darkness has been variously described as a journey inward, as a journey into the prehistoric times, and alternatively, it has also been accused of being a racist novel, because just as the part I was reading suggests, that for him, the humanity that inhabits the wilderness of Africa is a humanity which frightens Marlowe. He describes his relationship with these people as a remote kinship. So definitely, he believes that that modernity helps to humanize people, and he equates pre-modern, prehistoric places with savagery, with darkness. He does not even give them the credit of being humans. So this is a part of the problem with the text. So we will cover the second part of this in our next lecture. So let us conclude chapter 2. In the later half of chapter 2, there are a series of very important incidents which can later be linked with certain developments in chapter 3, in the final chapter. We can say that these incidents, which are, we can say, 3 or 4 in number, they are precursors to some developments which take place in the final chapter. They, these incidents are quite intriguing and mysterious in nature, and uh, the secret is, we can say, revealed in the final chapter, because we can link them to some characters, incidents, and some expository details in the final section. So, some 50 miles below the inner station, we came upon a hut of reeds. This is the first. This takes place 50 miles from the inner station where Kurtz resides. Here, they come upon a hut of reeds, and when Marlowe tries to explore this place, he finds a book lying there. The book is titled An Inquiry into Some Points of Seamanship by someone called Tower or Towson. Now, this is a book about shipping, and obviously it it arouses so many questions in the mind of Marlowe, related to the, discovery of this book at this strange place in a hut. Then there is a pile of wood there close by with a note. The note is a note of caution. It is written on the note, wood for you, hurry up, approach cautiously. So this incident takes place some, we are told, 40 miles from the inner station. This episode concludes with these lines. I had been dimly aware for some time of a whirring noise, and when I lifted my eyes, I saw the pile of woods. The wood pile was gone, and the manager, aided by all the pilgrims, was shouting at me from the riverside. I slipped the book into my pocket, and he also joins the others on the steamboat. So the entire episode is, there are things happening which cannot be explained. As I said, there is a cloud of mystery, intrigue, some kind of a plot at the back of the world of appearances, uh, which can be felt by the reader all the time. Now, this episode, like many others which will take place later on, is quite strange, inexplicable, it is intriguing and mysterious. Who are these people, who are kind of awaiting their arrival and responding to it in strange ways? The next uh, Yes, towards the evening of the second day, we judged ourselves about 8 miles from Kurtz's station. So when they are 8 miles from the inner station where Kurtz resides, they decide to halt, take a pause for a night on the advice of the manager. Let me read again. Towards The evening of the second day, we judged ourselves about 8 miles from Kurtz's station. I wanted to push on, but the manager looked grave and told me the navigation up there was so dangerous that it would be advisable, the sun being very low already, to wait where we were till next morning. So they decide to 8 miles from Kurtz's station, they decide to stop overnight because it is not considered entirely safe to progress towards the station. Now, at this place, there is, yes, there is a sudden noise which surprises them. This noise is in the form of a clamor from behind. Now there is a blanket of mist which has come down suddenly during the night, and towards the morning the mist has not cleared, and towards the morning a strange clamor fills the air. This clamor is described in these words. Yes, uh, there are wailing sounds, shrieks, okay, and a lot of noise from somewhere deep within the wilderness. Yes, there is apprehension that these people who are who are creating this clamor from behind the bushes may attack them. But then the attack actually does not take place. What made the idea of attack inconceivable to me was the nature of the noise, of the cries we had heard. They had not the fierce character boding of immediate hostile intention. Unexpected, wild, and violent as they had been, they had given me an irresistible impression of sorrow. The glimpse of the steamboat had, for some reason, filled those savages with unrestrained grief. So, there is this second development where they hear these sorrow stricken uh, and what is described as grief filled shrieks uh, and cries from somewhere the behind the wilderness, behind the bushes, as if there is an irresistible sorrow in the minds of these people. Then, 1.5 miles from the station, the third development takes place. There is actually an attack. The action was very far from being aggressive. It was not even defensive in the usual sense. It was undertaken under the stress of desperation, and in its essence was purely protective. So while small sticks begin to fly all around them in the air, an attack takes place. Okay, little sticks were flying about, thick. They were whizzing before my nose, dropping below me, striking behind me against my pilot house. All this time, The river, the shore, the woods were very quiet, perfectly quiet. I could not hear the heavy splashing thumb of the stern wheel and the patter of these things. So the attack does take place actually. No, the little sticks actually, which we know are arrows, begin to whiz past their faces, their noses, their sticks are all around in the air. But then there is a perception in the mind of Marlowe that this this attack has not been undertaken out of any fierce sense of hostility. Rather, it seems to be an act of desperation, okay? And protective. It is purely protective. So this is the third development which takes place before they actually reach the inner station and get to see and meet that enigmatic figure of Kurtz. Now, while these inexplicably strange things takes place, doubts creep into the mind of Marlowe that probably their journey would end as a futile journey. Why? Because to tell you the truth, I was morbidly anxious to change my shoes. No, this is a small detail. This attack leads to the death of the helmsman who is responsible for steering the steamboat and who is a black individual. So, at the end of this attack, once they escape from there and begin the last part of their approach to Kurtz. Marlowe says that and by the way, I suppose Mr. Kurtz is dead as well by this time. There was a sense of extreme disappointment, as though I had found out I had been striving after something altogether without a substance. I couldn't have been more disgusted if I had travelled all the way for the sole purpose of talking with Mr. Kurtz. Then I made the strange discovery that I had never imagined him as doing, but as discoursing. I didn't say to myself, now I will never see him, or now I will never shake him by the hand, but now I will never hear him. So these are the feelings in the mind of Marlowe at this point of time, that probably there is an apprehension that maybe he will not meet Kurtz, that maybe by the time they reach the inner station, Kurtz will be dead. Of course, Kurtz will not be dead because, of course, I was wrong. The privilege was waiting for me. Oh, yes, I heard more than enough. And I was right too. A voice. He was very little more than a voice. So at this point, I can say that the final part of this novel is about Kurtz, because the novel has been moving towards this enigmatic figure, and the final chapter, chapter 3, okay, will deal with Kurtz and his death, and it will also deal with his purpose for coming to Africa and the outcome of his coming, which is actually very close to the thematic issues in the novel. But at this point, Kurtz, before we are introduced to Kurtz and we get to see Kurtz physically through Marlowe. Okay, once again, Kurtz is described as a voice. Okay, he is not described like other European characters in his physical dimensions. He is a voice, a person who can be identified with some kind of a discourse. Okay, I will develop this idea later on when we will relate the meaning of this text with the theme of the European ideals being put to test in Africa. Okay, and there Kurtz has a symbolic role. There we begin to uh, read so many symbolic meanings in Kurtz as a personification of European ideals, okay, who is who is relocated in Africa and who has a very exalted sense of his okay, of his mission to humanize the Africans. Okay. So there are three things which I have already in my earlier lecture also mentioned. One is how is Africa presented or represented to us, number one. Second, what does Kurtz, what does Kurtz embody? What is he the embodiment of? Okay, and how do we perceive this encounter between Kurtz and the African darkness? Okay, so here we are in the last part of this chapter. Okay, uh, we are introduced to the person of Kurtz. Yes, he is described as a person who's obsessed with ivory. Apart from ivory, he's obsessed with the the African world, the African territories, the river. And the third thing he is obsessed with is a lady whom he addresses as my intended. Now, he is described as bald. He has no hair on his head. It seemed that the wilderness had patted him on the head, and behold, his head, it was like a ball, an ivory ball. It had caressed him. The wilderness had caressed him, had withered, he had withered. It had taken him, loved him, embraced him, got into his veins, consumed his flesh, sealed his soul to its own by the inconceivable ceremonies of some devilish initiation. You should have heard him say, my ivory. Oh, yes, I heard him. My intended, my ivory, my station, my river, my everything belonged to him. Now, there is a hint, a very important hint here that Kurtz has been transformed as a result of his sojourn, his life in Africa. There is in Africa, according to the text, there is the life in Africa, we can say, is very different from life in Europe. Okay, and we are given a suggestion that Kurtz here he presides over some strange arcane ceremonies, and he has become a kind of a deity for the savages. Okay. Sacrifices, it seems, are offered to him. So then there is some details related to Kurds in the same chapter. The original Kurds had been educated partly in Africa, in England, and as he was good enough to say himself, his sympathies were in the right place. His mother was half English, his father was half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurds. And what was the purpose of what was the reason for his arrival in Africa? We are told that the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. And he had written it too. I have seen it. And the report ends with a phrase. He had prepared this report for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. He had prepared this report after coming to Africa, but the report ended with a phrase. The phrase is exterminate all the brutes. Now, what does this mean? We will look at it when we discuss the thematic issues in the text. So, with this, chapter 2 ends, and there are, as I said, 3 developments on the way. Finally, he reaches the inner station. We are given some information about Kurtz's appearance, his background, and the purpose of his visit to Africa. So we are left with the third and the final chapter.